our Torah portion is called Vayishlach, which it begins in Genesis chapter 32, verse 3, and it's going to go over into chapter 36. But in this particular portion, we see Jacob's flight from Canaan coming full circle now. He, remember, had to flee Esau's anger. His mother told him, you need to get out of here because your brother is planning to kill you because of what you said and what you did. And so now, 20 years later, he's returning to Canaan at God's instruction. And as he approaches Canaan, he hears that Esau is coming to meet him with a 400-man army. And so in the beginning of verse 3, it says, then Jacob sent Vayishlach. Shalach means to go out or to be sent out. And then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female servants. And I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight. Then the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. And so Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. So if you'll remember, the last word that Jacob had received regarding Esau, and this was through his mother, was that his brother intended to kill him as soon as their father died. And that's recorded in chapter 27, verse 41. Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand, then will I slay my brother Jacob. And so Esau's plan is, as soon as dad dies, Jacob will die very soon thereafter. But now, Isaac hasn't died at this point. In fact, we don't see his death until toward the end of this Torah portion. And so Esau hasn't really fallen through with that plan, obviously. But if Jacob has been ordered to come back into the land and Esau's still there, then it was inevitable that Jacob was going to have to confront Esau in order to enter the land. And so there is a principle that we see here in the very beginning. To fulfill our purpose, if you will, to possess the land, requires confronting obstacles. And not just any obstacle, but some of the more ominous obstacles, things that we really don't want to have to deal with. Prophetically speaking, later on, Israel under Moses, ultimately Joshua, if you'll recall, when they came into the land of Canaan, they had to not only confront Edom, they had to engage him as well, but they had to confront the giants that were already there in the land. And so whether we're talking about giants, and this is not a day to have the conversation about the Nephilim, that's not really what I'm going to get into, but whether we have to confront giants, fortified cities, because that's what they had to deal with in the land of Canaan as well, or someone who was sworn to destroy you, you and I as God's people will ultimately have to confront those things in our lives, some of those things that we don't really want to have to deal with if we could avoid it. And so then, after all of these years, him being in Syria, God had plenty of time to do something with Esau if he wanted to. But God did not miraculously remove Esau from the picture. He just kind of left him there. When Israel was first going into the land, or first had opportunity to go into the land, remember, they saw the fortified cities, they saw the giants, and they kind of backed off. They didn't want to do this. They balked at the idea of going in because they felt like, well, we're just grasshoppers in their sight, and they're going to have us for breakfast. But 38 years later, when it came time for their descendants to enter in the land, guess who's still there? The fortified cities are still there. The giants are still there. And those things still had to be confronted in order for Israel to possess the land. And so those who refused to do this were bound to wander until they died. In fact, in Numbers 14, say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will do to you. The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in this wilderness. All of you who were numbered according to your entire number from 20 years old and above, except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you to dwell in, but your little ones, and this is the point, your little ones whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. Because, among other things, that generation was ready and willing to face the obstacles, the giants, the fortified cities. And so the point of all of this is, for you and for me, whether we like it or not, and sometimes we don't, if we are going to possess the land, if we are going to fulfill our purpose, if we're going to function in our purpose, we have to face the enemy. And so one generation balked at the idea of it, but that doesn't mean that it still didn't have to be done, because the next generation had to deal with it. And so I would suggest to my generation, those things that we don't address now, those giants that we don't face now, basically we're just kicking the can down the road for this next generation to deal with. And that would not be a good thing if the Father is expecting us to deal with those things. Amen? All right. It also seems to me, principally, that God requires us to face those things that causes us to fear. How many of you like getting a piece of mail in the mailbox that has Internal Revenue Service written on it? There's just something about that, or Department of Treasury, or however they do it. There's just something about getting that piece of mail that causes you to go, oh. So I'm just using that as an example, all right? But there are these things that, whether we like to admit it or not, we're intimidated by them, we're fearful of them, and God causes us to face those things that we fear. He doesn't necessarily remove those things from our path. He leaves them there. Because I've been praying for years that God would just eradicate the Internal Revenue Service, but it's still there. All right? That's not a political statement. It's just a personal preference, okay? I don't think I'm alone in that. However, he doesn't just make those things disappear. He leaves those things there for us to face, because if we don't face them and if we do not overcome them, somehow or another they become greater in our minds than God. They become as God, in the sense that we fear those things more than we fear God, which is a really big problem considering that he has called us to fear him and to fear him alone. Think back to when Moses comes into Egypt to tell the Hebrews that I've met with God and it's time for us to leave this land and I'm going to go appear before Pharaoh. And he goes and he speaks to Pharaoh for the first time. The Lord says to let my people go. And Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I should let Israel go? I'm not going to let him go. I'm going to make things worse. Since you've got so much time on your hands, they need to make the same tally of bricks, but yet they're going to be forced to fetch their own straw. And so after this, first encounter, Moses and Aaron comes out, and the elders of Israel hear that they are now going to be forced to provide their own straw and yet make the same amount of bricks. They said to Moses and to Aaron in Exodus 5, verse 21, let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. And so my point here is that the elders of Israel, upon hearing the bad news, not what they were expecting, they are angry with Moses and Aaron. They have quickly forgotten what the word of the Lord was to Moses, that it was time for them to be brought out, and it was going to be verified with signs and wonders. But it seems to me, at least at this point, they were more fearful of what Pharaoh could do than they were of what God was going to do. Pharaoh was there, that someone they could see, and they could, relate to all the things that have already happened. And so again, it seems that they're more fearful of Pharaoh than they are the God of Israel. And frankly, that it will be verified again and again throughout the journey. They're always looking to go back. There's always something that's the problem. So, God will not allow people, he will not allow places, he will not allow things and institutions, those things that cause us to shudder. He will not allow those things to remain the principal thing in our lives. He will not allow those things to become a God in our life. And by that, I don't mean necessarily worshipful, but you revere what you fear. You may not like it, but you revere it if you fear it. And so he will not permit those things to remain gods in our lives, not without a fight, not without challenging us. And so then if we are to serve only the true God, then all these other gods have to go. And once again, I want to emphasize this, not just the things that we like and esteem, the things that we fear. Because once again, those things we fear, we revere them. We They have a way, if we're not careful, of, in our hearts and minds, consciously or unconsciously, becoming superior to the God of Israel. So when God judged the gods of Egypt, it was to demonstrate that the Egyptians and what they served, they were serving nothing gods. They were serving these inanimate objects. But he didn't have to prove it just to the Egyptian. It was also to demonstrate to Israel that the Egyptian gods were nothing gods. In fact, they were nothing to fear. The God of Israel alone is to be feared. So in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 12 and 13, do not say a conspiracy concerning all that this people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. So if we're going to be afraid or intimidated or fearful or anything like that, then it should be the Lord. I mean, a lot of people are freaking out right now up in Connecticut and Pennsylvania and New Jersey about drones. Now, I haven't seen anything flying over my property, but, this has got all these people upset, and they're kind of wondering what's going on. People are talking about shooting them down. I'm just using this as an illustration. Things like that can very quickly put fear in people's hearts, and their minds go somewhere else. But whatever we would regard as a conspiracy, whatever we would regard as something that, man would be intimidated by, we need to remember that the Lord of hosts, him alone, is the one we are to fear. He alone is the one we are to dread. In Jeremiah 5, verse 22, do you not fear me, says the Lord? Will you not tremble at my presence? Who have placed the sand as the bound of the sea by perpetual decree that it cannot pass beyond it. And though its waves toss to and fro, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, yet they cannot pass over it. So the point should be obvious here. As his people, we are to fear him. We are to revere him above all others. And so then it's logical and consistent, considering we are to fear him more than all others, that he would require his people to face those other things that they fear and to overcome those things. And so all of that is to say, this is kind of established as a precedent when Jacob is compelled to face Esau. Now, Jacob's already been through a lot up until this point. He's had to deal with Lavan. He has struggled with Lavan. He has struggled with the accusations and the cheating and the abuse. And he overcome all of those things because he was persistent. He did it with morality. He did it with some shrewdness and some wit, which some people, I think, mistakenly interpret as being deceitful. It's not deceitful to be shrewd. It's not deceitful to, use your wit, to use your brains, to better yourself or to overcome something. So my point there is, in that regard, where Lavan was concerned and how he dealt with all that, he had more than proven himself to be worthy to bear the title Israel, which is, which comes in this Torah portion. Yet there was that other thing that had to be addressed, that thing called Esau. There are some adversaries that cannot be overcome until we overcome our fear of them. I think that, and I know I've said this from time to time through the years, at some point in our life, maybe multiple times in our lives, we are going to come to that place where there's this thing we have to face and we have to deal with, and that brings us to the place where we start struggling with God. I know I have. I probably will again. And it boils down to this. I know you said you'd do this, but are you going to do this? Because here are all these things that we're facing that I'm very fearful of, uncertain of the outcome. And I know you said you'd do it, but I'm apprehensive, I'm anxious. Are you going to do those things? Am I the only one that's been at that place? Okay. So then, it's in that struggle with God that, or on the heels of that, I should say, that comes this pronouncement: you're not going to be called the guy who has to walk around shielding his head all the time, but you're going to be called Israel. You are to be Israel. Now, when the messengers returned saying that Esau is coming to you with 400 men, it says that Jacob was greatly afraid and was distressed. I probably would be too. Remember, again, he fled this guy because this guy was planning to kill him. And now he's coming with 400 guys. If he was coming to kiss and make up, why does he need 400 friends to join him? Right? If his intention was peaceful, why this mass of men, presumably armed men? So then, this presents a pattern. When we find these kinds of situations, we have to have these encounters in our life. The Bible produces a pattern for us in how we can respond, or how we should respond, perhaps. First of all, though distressed, though fearful, Jacob took action. And the first thing he did was what? He prayed. He turned to God for assistance. Verse 10 and 11. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. In other words, you have multiplied me. You've been very gracious to me. You've favored me. You've blessed me. But I want you to deliver me now from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him that he may come and attack me and the mothers with the children. So again, he recognizes God's goodness upon him until that point. And he even acknowledges that I'm unworthy of all of these things. And how many of us can associate with that sense? Being unworthy of all these things. And yet he has blessed us. I was just yesterday, I was just looking out my back window and just, once again, just overwhelmed that God has been good to me, to my family, and it's just kind of overwhelming sometimes. And yet I realize that he didn't have to do any of this. None of us are worthy of our own merit to obtain these blessings. It's just the goodness of God. And so Jacob recognizes that. And on top of that, Jacob recognizes, as we should as well, that because we are the recipient of these blessings, we should never lose sight of that. We should always remain humble and grateful and thankful for those things. But to also recognize that those blessings are indicators of the responsibility that has been entrusted to us. Those things that go along with all of those blessings. And, in fact, I'm of the view, have for a long time been of the view, that the difference between Jacob and Esau is that Jacob recognized the responsibility that went along with the blessing. Esau just wanted the blessing without the responsibility. And that's why Esau wasn't worthy to be called Israel. Jacob was. And so then those who strive for righteousness recognize that there is a great responsibility that goes along with that. And we also recognize how easy it is to fall short of God's standards. How many of you have realized that yet? Yes, again. So, humility is an indication of those who really understand and revere and appreciate our God's greatness and how short we fall and how we don't really measure up in and of ourselves to his standards. And yet, he calls us, he works in us, he works through us, he works for us. He does these things because he's on our side. And it's also notable that even though Jacob loves God, he's wanting to serve God, he is striving to be a man who pursues righteousness, he acknowledges that, hey, I'm fearful of Esau. I'm just going to be real with you, God. I am afraid of this guy. I'm afraid of what he might do. And maybe it's because of that fear that part of his response to the news is, I'm going to get all these gifts together, and I'm going to send all these gifts. And if you were reading that this week, that was a lot. I mean, that's a lot of animals. And I'm just thinking about all the people it takes to take care of all those animals. So this is a huge group of people, apparently. It's a huge camp, and yet he is fearful of Esau coming with 400 men. Anyway, so because he's fearful, maybe that plays a part in why he sent this large gift before him, all these animals. Maybe it was to seem impressive for Esau to recognize how Jacob, even though he's kind of been in exile, nevertheless he's thrived. God has blessed him greatly. Perhaps it's to give the impression that those who were with Jacob were more numerous than those that were with Esau. And on the physical side, I don't know, but on the spiritual side, definitely. Because remember, at the end of the last Torah portion, he saw camps of angels that were getting ready to go before him into the land. But beyond that, there are some commentators that say that Jacob's methods as he goes to encounter Esau are the preferred method when we encounter Esau. Because Esau is not just the man who lived a long time ago, but Esau is our nemesis. Esau is our perhaps greatest adversary in terms of the patterns that we find in the Bible. Because Esau's wrath continues on and on and on. And there's prophecies that talk about that. So in other words, if we're going to have to deal with Esau, there are some commentators that suggest that initially what we should try to do is to turn his wrath away before we resort to war. In other words, don't just rush into a fight. Because Proverbs says a soft answer turns away wrath. But a harsh word does what? Stirs up anger. I mean, there are some things that we could do to incite those people who already don't like us. But why do that? Because if you're like me, I'm tired. I want some peace. So why just, twist and incite people to wrath? So I know what some of you are thinking, and we're going to get to the fight aspect of it in just a minute. But when it comes to our adversaries, I'm suggesting, because the Bible presents it, that there are occasions when it would be wise of us to try to live peaceably with our adversaries, if that is possible. Sometimes it's not. But if it's possible, we should try to do that. In other words, it isn't wise to provoke our adversaries unnecessarily. Here's what Paul said in Romans 12. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, and there's a key phrase there, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Again, passages to suggest that there are occasions, if we can do it, it would be better to live peaceable, even with those who we consider to be our adversaries. That does not mean condone their evil. It does not mean accommodate their evil. It means, if possible, as much as it depends on you and me, to try to live peaceably. In other words, don't provoke them to wrath. Messiah didn't go around provoking his enemies, and he had a lot of them. He didn't go around taunting them. He just went about doing the Father's business. Now, when he was confronted by some of these people, and, they started pushing all of his buttons, he would speak with authority, he would act with authority, but always with the focus of continuing on with the Father's business. And he would overcome those things, and did overcome those things. So, back to Jacob, we're presented with an opportunity and an example of what we might do in an attempt to live peaceably with those that are more powerful than us, or maybe even those that we perceive to be more powerful than us in some ways. Understand what I'm saying there? Rather than just provoking them to go to war, rather than just provoking them to fight. Now, that being said, let's balance it out. There are those times when we must be willing and prepared to fight. There are those occasions when we have to take the appropriate action. That's what Jacob did. One of the things he did was to divide the people into two companies, because he said if Esau attacks one, then the other which is left will escape. So he's thinking strategically. It's not wrong to strategize. I started to say to have strategery, but but anyway. So it's not wrong to have some kind of strategy here. And then there are the prophetic elements that we see in what he did, because Israel is to this day divided. And guess what? In part to survive the attacks from Edom, because Edom's still here. Esau's not here, the man, but Edom is still here. and still at work. And there's a lot of other prophecies that, and passages that we could read. Because again, throughout history, Esau, Edom, is the primary antagonist as Israel is concerned. And so then Jacob here, he is, what's going on here is presenting us to a pattern, things that are prophetic, but a pattern also how we might address certain situations that we have to encounter. And so he's seeking peace if it's possible. But at the same time, he is preparing to stand and to fight. And he is taking certain steps that if he has to do this, then he wants to do it wisely. So then how can we know when it is appropriate to stand and to fight? And getting punched in the face isn't necessarily the indicator. Because Messiah says that if you get struck on one side of your face, give them the other side. Now, he doesn't say what happens on the third one. But we need to be discerning about when it is appropriate to stand and to fight. We're coming into the season of Hanukkah. And what is that all about? It's about people who were oppressed, they were intimidated, they were bullied, and finally somebody said that's enough. And they took a stand. And so there are those times. And so when we find ourselves in any kind of a crisis, going to war shouldn't be our first go-to. Our first step should be to seek God's face in the matter, to get his wisdom on the matter. Is he saying, fight? Or is he saying, humble yourself before me? All right? And when we go to him, we know that we can get some direction. We have to be discerning. And then we're going to have to be responsible to make practical and wise decisions. So in other words, if you know of a coming crisis, trust in God, but at the same time, as you trust in God, do what you know to do, what is wise, what is prudent, what is biblical, what is sound. When it comes to a confrontation, it should, where you and I are concerned, whether to humble ourselves and follow the pattern that we see that Jacob expressed here or fight, I think it comes down to this. Whether or not someone is compelling me to replace my fear of God with a fear of them. Nebuchadnezzar tried to intimidate Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to fear him more than God. And he ramped up that fire to try to scare and intimidate them and influence them to fear him more than God. And you know how that story goes. Now, they didn't put up a fight in the sense that they were armed or anything. They just stood. And sometimes that's what we have to do. When you've done all that you can do to stand, right? Take a stand. It doesn't mean we have to throw fists. It just means that we have to take a stand for what is right. So again, if someone is compelling you and me to fear them more than we fear God, then that is when we're going to have to take a stand. And they may not even realize that what they're doing is causing you to fear them more than God. But you'll know. I'll know. And more importantly, God knows. So if people try to coerce us or force us, manipulate, that we fear them more than we fear God, we fear that more than we fear God, or it would cause disgrace to come upon his name, we have to fight. We have to resist. And again, that doesn't mean necessarily in a violent way. Sometimes it just means to stand. But whether we're suing for peace or whether we're taking a stand and positioning ourselves to fight, the fact remains that God's people are always going to have to face our adversary. Confronting Esau, and I put that in air quotes because Esau's long dead, but he's still here, if you understand what I mean. Confronting Esau is inevitable for you and for me if we are going to fulfill our purpose. I don't remember if I've told you this story or not, and if I have, forgive me for repeating myself. I won't go into all of the details, but there were several years ago, our family was going through a situation, and it was very frightening. It was very tiring. It was troublesome. It was, in terms of the spiritual aspect of things, it was probably one of the worst times that we've had to endure. And it was during that time that I shouldn't say evening, it was in the middle of the night. I was very restless. I couldn't sleep. And I didn't want to wake Beth up. And so I went out into the living room. I lay down on the couch. And the long and short of it is this. It was one of those experiences where it was a dream. There's no doubt about that. But it was one of those dreams that my eyes were shut. I knew I was asleep, but yet I saw the room where I was. I saw everything as it was. There was nothing weird or ethereal about it. I was looking at the room, seeing it just as if I were awake, but yet I knew I was asleep. And while I was sleeping on the couch, this something come and started whispering in my ear of all the awful things it had intended to do where my family was concerned. And it was one of the most frightening dreams that I've ever had. I mean, it was one of those that you wake up and you're looking around the room to see if that is still around. And as this thing got up right next to me, I could feel, it felt like an animal. It was speaking, but it felt like an animal. And it was all hairy. And I remember I told the lady who worked for us at the time, Joyce Young, I was telling her about this, and she said, well, Bill, don't you get it? I'm like, what? Esau. Because at the time I was teaching about these patterns in the story of Jacob and Esau and what Esau really is, and not just the man of long ago, but a spirit, a presence, a force that God's people always have to contend with. And when she told me that, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I say that to say this, that conflict continues. We will face Esau in these last days. We are facing Esau right now. But we cannot allow the fact that we have to face Esau to intimidate us and overwhelm us with fear and dread and doubt and uncertainty, these kinds of things. We're going to have to face Esau to fulfill our purpose, but we can't afford to fear him in the way that we would abandon that purpose. We can't be like Israel when they saw the giants and, we can't do this. And we see what that resulted in. So this idea that I'm talking about, or this, I believe, precept, it speaks to the individual and it speaks to the body at large. So in regard to the body at large, this encounter that Jacob is having with Esau is hinting at a last day battle that's going to occur. It's in the prophets. You read Ezekiel, you read Obadiah, this contest with Esau, with Edom. But according to the Torah portion, if this is a pattern or prophetic pattern, it actually seems to suggest that Joseph, and I use that in air quotes, that Joseph will be the last of the tribes to encounter Esau. In Genesis chapter 33, verse 1 and 2. Now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants. And he put the maidservants and their children in front, Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. The word last, it comes from a word acharon that means something that comes afterwards, something that is at the end. An example of where this word is used is in Psalm 102, and it says, when the Lord builds up Zion, and all the wonderful things that happen in regard to the restoration of Zion, he says that all those things are written for the generation to come. And the word acharon, generation to come, is the same word that's used here when it speaks of Joseph at the last. In other words, let me put it this way. Those who live outside of the land of Canaan, who don't look like the people who live in the land, but actually, as far as they're concerned, look Egyptian, to some degree function as Egyptians, and yet they are the seed of Abraham. They'll be some of the last to encounter Esau if this pattern, if this is to be regarded as a pattern. I would also add to that, just as a footnote, that the word acharon also alludes to the West. So what I'm getting at here is that not only are our brothers and friends in the land going to have to fight Esau, and there is a very literal war going on right now where that is what's going on. That's the essence of what's going on. But you and I, God's people throughout the world, are going to have to contend with Esau. And I don't necessarily mean in the form of Hamas or Hezbollah or anything like that, but we don't war against flesh and blood, right? We're warring against principalities and these entities. So, again, that is to suggest that because Joseph was at the end, those who live outside of the land, who look, speak, to some degree function as Egyptians, you understand what I'm trying to say here, and yet we realize that we are the seed of Abraham, are also going to have to contend with Esau. And so my point then is this, or the bigger point, the larger point, is as I shared last week, there is a climactic battle that is taking shape right now. There are things that are happening in our world that, in the physical, that are evidence that there is a spiritual war going on as well. And that's the war that you and I are engaged in. So this climactic battle is taking shape. And it may not be the battle that we think it is necessarily, but these current events, these things that are happening right now, lines are being drawn. Stephen came out last week at Midrash and talked a little bit about the things that were going on in Syria. Well, since that time, Bashar al-Assad has left, and all these different groups are fighting over who's going to control Syria. And a lot of people are going, well, it's a good thing that he's gone. But then they're saying, but it might be worse now. There's no stability there. And there's all these different things that are going on. So lines are being drawn. So a climactic battle is taking shape. And you and I, let's put ourselves for a moment in Jacob's sandals. If we are going to fulfill our purpose in this last day, we will have to face Esau. And Esau is probably that thing, that situation, that whatever, that causes you to shudder the most. That causes you and me to be intimidated. And so then, like Jacob, it's imperative that we seek the Father as never before. Because all of us who are called by his name will have to face our own Esau's. Now, I want you to consider this. As this Torah portion began, Jacob sent messengers, it said, to Seir, which is Esau's abode. This is where the land of Edom is, in Mount Seir. And we presume, seeing that he sent the messengers there, that this is where they found Esau and this is where they delivered their message. And furthermore, having delivered the message, it would be from Seir that Esau and the 400 men with him set out to meet Jacob. And here's why that is interesting. Now, the word Seir is derived from the root word sear. It's sin ayin resh. And this word describes Esau as being hairy. This is, in fact, the word that would often be used to describe a hairy goat. That's why Esau is associated with the goats. But this root word also means a very strong movement, and the idea behind that is a storm. In other words, the messengers returned to Jacob to report that a massive storm was headed his way. And when he heard this, he became frightened. And he began to seek God's guidance. Just this past week, and it's happened on several occasions over the last couple of months, I would say. The staff, as we sit around, have devotions once a week. A couple of times, a conversation has come up about the differences between cows and buffaloes. And actually, Danny Baker is the one who first brought this up. And it was something he said was very interesting. So as I'm connecting the dots, that Seir, it means a storm, and it's connected to Esau. I thought it was very interesting. So anyway, apparently when a storm is approaching, cows sense the storm, and they'll try to run away from the storm. And the problem is, cows aren't very fast. Really, they're not. In other words, they can't outrun the storm. The storm is going to catch up with the cows. And what happens then is instead of outrunning the storm, they end up running along with the storm, which then maximizes the amount of pain, the amount of frustration that they experience from that storm. Buffaloes, on the other hand, they see the storm approaching, and rather than running away, they charge directly into the storm. And doing that minimizes the amount of pain. It minimizes the amount of frustration that they are going to experience from that very same storm. And so by charging into the storm, that allows them to kind of pass through it quicker, and rather than being caught in it for an extended period of time. So all of that is to say that Esau was the storm, and Jacob was faced with a decision. He was not going to be able to move very fast with all those people and all those flocks and herds. In fact, later on, after he and Esau talked, and Esau's trying to get him to go to Seir, he says, man, look, you know how it is with kids and pets and everything. We've been traveling a long way, and I don't think we can afford to go and see you right now because all these kids and all the stuff that's going on, we'll catch up with you. Point is, Jacob really wasn't in a position where he could flee. It's as if God had led him to a situation where there was no choice but to face Esau. So, that being said, we need to recognize that God did give him 20 years to prepare for it. He gave him 20 years to prepare for it. A lot of things happened in Jacob's life over those 2 decades. But even though he gave him plenty of time to prepare for it, nonetheless, he was still destined to face Esau. And so likewise, there are storms that you and I are destined to face. And I choose to believe that God gives us ample time to prepare for those things. He equips us, he empowers us, he teaches us, he challenges, he reproves us, he chastens us when need be, because all of those storms, or you want to use the word test, or whatever the word that suits you best, there are those things that we must face if we are going to fulfill our purpose, if we are going to function in that purpose, if we are going to possess the land. And I would also suggest that this Torah portion presents this to us, that before we face that storm, the Esau, as it were, we will all wrestle with God. Because we will all have to acknowledge within ourselves that there are things, there are situations, there might even be people that if we are honest with ourselves, we really fear more than we fear God. And he brings that to the surface. And so we wrestle with God. And as Jacob did, we wrestle not to overpower God, but to wrest from God that we need from him in order to do what he's called us to do. It was also this past week in our staff devotional that Beth reminded us all that Jacob is compelled to go face Esau, but in advance of this confrontation where 400 guys are coming, Jacob's already intimidated by it. And so he gets with God to help me with this situation. And what did God do? He crippled him. He weakened him in the physical sense. And there's a lot of different tentacles that has, but I'm going to try to stay on track. What he did to him was not debilitating, but it was a limp, nevertheless, that he would carry with him the rest of his life. And that is how God sent him out to face the storm. In other words, not being able to depend upon his physical might, not being able to depend upon his physical strength. Because it's not by might nor by power, but it is by my spirit, says the Lord of armies. So I believe that is very, very important that we all recognize that when we have these storms of the caliber that Jacob is facing in this Torah portion, whereby we find ourselves wrestling with God about it because we're intimidated by it. God does not send us to face that adversary being high on ourselves. He sends us to face that adversary being very humbled and completely dependent upon him, and not in our own might, not in our wit, not in our whatever we've used in times past that may have gotten us to this place. But he sends us into that situation completely dependent upon him. And maybe that is one of the reasons that when Jacob goes out to appear before Pharaoh, he bows himself. He humbles himself before his adversary, someone who had threatened to kill him. But I want to suggest that in doing that, in reality, Jacob was humbling himself before God and saying, I'm putting my life in your hands. You've promised that you will be with me wherever I go, that you will multiply my seed, that you will bless my descendants. And here comes this man with 400 armed friends that I am going to humble myself before, because what I'm saying is I'm putting my life into your hands. That idea brings us to a final point. God had told Jacob that he was destined to overcome and that he was destined to prevail. So we need to be reminded that, a lot of our existence may have been having to, what we felt anyway, we had to shield our head from the heel of our adversary. But that is not who we're supposed to be. We're not supposed to be the tail. We're supposed to be the head. If we're walking the way we're supposed to be walking, and that does not mean imperfection, because we haven't attained that, and we won't really until Messiah comes, but nevertheless, if we're striving for righteousness, if we're seeking to overcome, and we're walking upright before him, then we have this promise that we take our heel and we put it on the head of the serpent, that we overcome and we prevail against our enemies. And so as Israel, we are destined to prevail over our enemies. But to prevail over them, we have to face them. To overcome them, we have to engage them. We have to encounter them. And because Jacob prevailed with God, he wrested from God that which he needed. And what was it? It wasn't an army backing him up in the traditional or conventional sense of the word. It was a new name, and it was a new walk. And it was with a reassurance that what I told you 20 years before is still true today. And it will come to pass that because you have prevailed with God, that you will prevail in the future. Not just Jacob going to meet Esau, but all of those who wrestle with God and all the Esau's that we would ever have to face, even unto the end of the age. Because you prevail with God, you will prevail against men. So our enemy, again, is not the person, it's not the flesh and blood. Our enemy is the adversary. But he works through those who are of the wicked one. And so we have to engage and encounter those kinds of situations, which in this context is the Esau's and the Edoms of the world that is represented in this world. And in Esau and Edom, it's not just in the Middle East. It's in the West too. Esau is here with us presently. And this notion speaks to God's people for all time. That if we are going to prevail, then we're going to wrestle with God. There's no question about it. But again, that's not to overcome God. It's to be submitted to God so that we can overcome Esau, our greatest antagonist, perhaps our greatest fear. So it must be that we overcome if we are going to possess, which requires us, as I said, that we should walk as Israel walked. That is to say, upright before God. When we walk in that manner, I'm going to connect another story, not mine, but a biblical story, to this notion. When we walk upright and we're striving for his purpose in our lives, then obviously we need to keep our focus on the Messiah. And I'm convinced that it is so easy to get our focus elsewhere. All that needs to happen is for there to be drones in the air. Or, this situation or that situation. And it's just so easy for us. I mean, years ago, I used to have this message and I would address things like what we were, it seemed anyway, at the time in the Messianic Hebrew roots movement, so fascinated by, and that was, black helicopters and FEMA camps and where did the Nephilim come from? What is the shape of the earth? And all these kinds of things. And we would just, people were fussing and feuding and fighting all over those things all the time, it seemed to me anyway. And, I could go into mainstream Christianity. I could find things that people get focused on there and just worldwide. My point is, it's just too easy for me, and I dare say for a lot of us, it's just too easy for us to get our focus on the storm and not the one who's in the midst of the storm, the one who walks through the storm with us. Because we do have that promise, right? And so there's that time when Yeshua comes walking on the water, and only one guy said anything. It was so brazen to say, if it's you, Lord, bid me to come to you. And that was Peter, of course. And though we tend to focus on the fact that he got his eyes off the Messiah, and that is important to consider, and when he got his eyes off the Messiah, he sank. Thankfully, Yeshua was close enough to save him. But there was apparently an instant. How long, I don't know. But there was an instant when this mere man was walking on the waves. And that blows my mind. But what was the key? He had his focus on the Messiah. So, I don't expect that will literally ever happen to me. I won't box God in. But what I will say is, I believe that each and every one of us are going to be given an opportunity when the storm comes to be able to walk on the storm, so to speak. To be, just as we are given the authority to trample on scorpions and serpents, it seems to me that, metaphorically at least, we have been given the promise that if we keep our eyes on the Messiah, we'll be able to walk on the waves. We'll be able to walk on the storm. The storm might be swirling around us. We might be right in the middle of it. We can hear it. We can feel it. But as long as we keep our eyes on him, we can overcome it. That would have been a very fearful thing for me personally, because I'm not the best swimmer. To this day, I'm not. In fact, how old was I? 20, 21? My wife taught me how to swim. After dark, we snuck into the pool at the apartment complex, and she taught me how to swim. And so that would be a fearful thing for me. And to think about climbing outside of the boat and putting your foot down on something you know is going to give way, and yet keeping our eye on the Messiah, and it doesn't. That's fascinating. But that is why you and I have to keep our focus where it is supposed to be, should have always been, and should forever be. And it's why you and I need to embrace the name, which is a call to be a people called Israel, to walk in a way that others will see as evidence that we are his people. And when it comes time for us to face that storm, that rather than running away from it, trying to outrun it, trying to avoid it, that because we know he's in the midst of that, we run directly into it. Amen?